Hi there, and welcome to video 7 of the Flipped History series. This video about Confederation, or the British North America Act, will have 3 learning intentions. The first learning intention is to describe the purpose and outcome of the Charlottetown Conference and the Quebec Conference. The second learning intention is to evaluate the positions both for and against Confederation. And finally, the last learning intention is to describe the governmental system and division of powers that were created by the British North America Act. So after the Great Coalition that brought together those 3 political parties, the Grits, the Liberal Conservatives, and the Bleus, led by George Brown of the Grits, John A. Macdonald of Liberal Conservatives, and the Bleus of Georges-Étienne Cartier, they wanted to propose what they called a federal union, or a system that had a division of powers between 2 levels of government, a federal government or central government and provincial governments. So they got their first real chance at the Charlottetown Conference, which happened in September of 1864. At first, this was supposed to be a conference for the leaders of the maritime colonies, PEI, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland, but the Canadians kind of invited themselves, and they came, and when they came to Charlottetown, they proposed a federal union and kind of convinced the others that this was the way to go. So a month later, they met at Quebec, and this was the Quebec Conference in October of 1864. Yeah, all the colonies were there, and what they proposed was a government system that would have an elected, what they called lower house, which is today our House of Commons, based on the system of representation by population, an upper house, which is today the Senate, appointed on a regional basis. Responsible government would be the backbone of this new system, and they came together and developed, under the guidance really of John A. Macdonald, 72 resolutions that they would propose to London. Now, after the Quebec Conference, there was a series of debates in all of the legislative assemblies in these colonies to decide whether or not they were going to accept or reject the proposals. In the end, there were 4 that came out in favor of them: Upper and Lower Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. But we'll get into the positions for and against in a little bit. Then in 1866, they met in London again to draft the Constitution, which is known as the British North America Act. This divided responsibilities between the federal and provincial governments, and eventually this was passed in the spring of 1867 by the British Parliament, which created Canada, which became an official self-governing dominion July 1st, 1867. In terms of the arguments for and against Confederation, there are kind of 3 main arguments, both for, and 3 main arguments against. The first argument for Confederation was that an increase in trade and market for manufactured goods in the Maritimes would offset the loss of the Reciprocity Treaty to the United States. As well, there was an increase in demand, especially for raw materials, especially coal, which Nova Scotia had a lot of. So by linking these provinces, there could be a new market centered along this intercolonial railway. The second major argument for was that there was strength in numbers against possible American expansionism. So that by being separate, especially the smaller provinces maybe couldn't defend themselves, but together Canada would have a chance. The third was that by coming together, then Canada can then turn its attention to the west, where there was a demand for more settlement in the territory owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, which was called Rupert's Land. So a lot of people in Upper Canada wanted to move westward, and only by securing a united Canada could they begin to do so. Now, those against Confederation were centered mostly around French Canadians and the smaller provinces in the east. So French Canadian nationalists centered around their view really was that they wanted to protect their faith and their language. These were both nationalists, like the survival nationalists associated with the Catholic Church, but also the Rouge Party as well. They were really afraid of domination by the English. As well, smaller provinces were also afraid of domination by central Canada. Provinces like New Brunswick and PEI were afraid that they would have no power in either the elected lower house or the appointed upper house, because the way that the appointed upper house was supposed to function is that Ontario would get 24 seats, Quebec would get 24 seats, and then the Maritimes as a region would get 24 seats. So they knew that they would be outnumbered. In Nova Scotia's case, one of the strongest arguments against it was that they were already tied to a kind of economic system, which was the British Empire. They were more focused on transatlantic trade rather than continental trade. So most of their wealth came from trade with Britain and British colonies, especially in the Caribbean. Nevertheless, Confederation did happen, mostly because of the work of John A. Macdonald and the fact that the political elite wanted this to happen, as well as the British. So it was kind of, once it was proposed, it was, all but assured of happening. Now, PEI did not join Confederation at first, and neither did Newfoundland, but the four main provinces, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia did. Now, the system of government that was set up is still the system of government that we have today. So there are two levels of government, and their powers are set out in sections 91 for federal powers and 92 for provincial powers. And some of the main powers in section 91 include things like banking and defense and weights and measures and the post office. These are all federal powers. Now, in section 92, in the provincial powers, are things like regulating municipalities, education, and healthcare. As well, there's also section 93, which was an important part of the powers because it protected minority rights. So once again, French Canadians really wanted to protect their education and language rights. So Section 93 protects public and separate schools. As well, there were additional protections in the British North America Act for Anglophones in Quebec. So, for example, French and English were recognized as only official languages in Quebec and federal institutions under Section 133. And the English in Quebec were granted protections by the fact that Quebec had an appointed legislative council in its government, and there were 12 ridings in the Quebec Assembly that were guaranteed for English speakers. So the system of government is that the people elect the House of Commons, right? The House of Commons is then where the ministers, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are chosen from, and then there's what's known also as the Upper House or the Senate, and these were appointed by the Governor General. So we have two different levels of our Parliament, the lower house or the House of Commons, and the Senate, which is the upper house. Now, all of our provinces also have elected legislative assemblies. They go by different names. In Ontario, it's called Provincial Parliament. In Quebec, it's now called the National Assembly. But in essence, it's the same system without a Senate. So people elect representatives from their local areas. There's a cabinet of ministers, and then there's a premier, or in Quebec, the literal translation is prime minister, and they represent their areas. Now, because our system is one where provinces have exclusive areas of responsibility, There's also a lieutenant governor that represents the British government or the British Crown in each of our provinces. There's one extra thing that we have to consider with the powers that were set up in Confederation, and that is that the federal government had two extra powers. One power was the power of dissolution. So if the federal government didn't agree with any provincial powers, they could disallow this power. They could reject provincial legislation. As well, the federal government reserved the right for anything not set out in the Constitution or the British North America Act in the future would then be a power of the federal government. Hey, thanks for watching. I know this was a long one, but I want you to consider the following essential question. How does the BNA Act impact our lives today?